Shabbat Shalom. We already learned this morning from our bar mitzvah about Joseph's rise to power. From being incarcerated, from being in prison, to interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, to becoming the viceroy, the second in command in Egypt. Except, there's one aspect that we missed. I would argue that it wasn't Joseph at all that took on this leadership role. In fact, after he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, Pharaoh gave him his signet ring, gave him Egyptian garb and linens to wear, and gave him the name Tzafneh Paneach, an Egyptian name, to take on a new identity. It wasn't Yosef ben Yisrael. It wasn't Joseph, a child of Israel, a child of Jacob, who took on this role. In fact, he had to hide who he was in order to safely take lead in Egypt. I think about the Hanukkah story after we just completed this 8-day festival. And one of the stories we tell is the story of the Maccabees being victorious, this ragtag team against this large Assyrian Greek army. But in fact, one of the reasons these Assyrian Greeks were so large was because of Hellenization, because so many among them were Jews in the community who said, okay, I'm happy to give up my identity fully and embrace Greek culture and religion and societal influence. That just as much as there were the Maccabees who were fighting and proudly being who they were, there were those who were willing to hide who they were in order to be safe, in order to succeed. Think about the juxtaposition of these two things. Of those who opted to hide their identities in the Hanukkah story. Of Joseph, who opted to hide his identity in our Torah this morning in order to live safely and freely in Egypt. And in fact, later in our Parsha, when Joseph's brothers, the same brothers who he was not on great terms with, some who wanted to kill him, some who threw him in a pit, some who sold him into slavery and servitude, when they came groveling before him to Egypt because they experienced famine in Canaan, in Canaan, and there was no stockpiling of grains like Joseph, or should I say Tzafneh Paneach, had prepared. The text tells us that he immediately recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. Was it that he was so far removed from his former self? Was it that he hid so much of his true and authentic self? Was it that they just assumed that he was dead? But text tells us, Vayitnaker alehem v'daber itam kashot, that he acted intentionally like a stranger to them, spoke harshly to them. V'ker Yosef et achav v'hem lo hikruhu. That he knew them, but they didn't recognize him at all. He was a shell of himself. In order to be, in order to live, he was so far removed from his identity that his own brothers didn't even recognize him. And maybe he hid who he was to them, as some of our Mefarshim, some of our interpreters suggest, because he was testing them. Right? The Parsha ends, the Torah portion ends with him putting a goblet, a cup in Benjamin's sack to see how they would respond. He doesn't want to be on good terms with those who scorned him previously. But maybe he also hid who he was because he was scared. He was scared to share his true self, his full self. On Thursday night, I had the privilege of being with the governor and first lady, Phil and Tammy Murphy, when they were lighting the Hanukkah, and the Attorney General of New Jersey, Matt Placken, was there, and he was speaking as the lead law enforcement officer in New Jersey about rising and increasing anti-Semitism throughout the state. And he made a point of being there specifically to say how important it was to light menorah at that moment. I know I'm being careful talking in front of a government employee about the separation of religion and state, but he was saying how important it was at that moment, with increased bigotry, to do this act, this religious act, proudly and publicly. I thought about that, and then 2 days later, as we read in our Torah, that one of our patriarchs, Yosef, who did the opposite, who hid who he was out of fear. We know throughout history, Jewish people have had to do so time and time again, and I take pride at a time of increased anti-Semitism that the state, at least, publicly and proudly celebrates without fear. In fact, looking back at the lessons of Hanukkah, which we just celebrated, even the Talmud, right, some 1,500 plus years ago, was written that, well, we light the menorah and we display it in our doorways or in our windows at Sha'at Sakana, at times where it is dangerous. We light them in our homes so others can see. At times that it is dangerous to fully and proudly celebrate our faith. 1,500 years ago, that was said. But time and time again this week, we did so publicly. Our two towns gathered to light menorah with elected officials on Springfield Avenue in Maplewood. We had many celebrations and menorah lighting throughout town. I take pride in the idea that we refuse to be Joseph. Not just refuse to be Joseph and take advantage of others in their vulnerable states, as our bar mitzvah told us, but refuse to live in fear. We go forward in celebration, being proud of who we are. My hope and prayer for all of us, for all of the identities that define each of us in this space, that we never feel like we have to hide who we are, but that we live in a world and build a world in which we can all proudly and publicly share ourselves with the world. Because when we do, that is when the world will fully be that peaceful idea, that Gan Eden, that God set out to build. A world of peace, a world of tranquility, when we can all, side by side, proudly be our true selves. Amen.